So today I am going to talk about a project that's really situated in a bigger project that I was involved in. And actually I hope to get everybody talking to each other. I have some work for you to do today, okay? So we're going to be looking at some different tasks that we designed and the ways that they were enacted in a classroom, particularly making note of how teachers leverage opportunities for inclusion and equity to help students access the task. So just to give just a little bit of background, because I said this is situated in a bigger project that we're doing called the Next Generation Science Assessment Project. And this project is an effort to design three-dimensional middle school tasks that are really aligned with the NGSS. Now, one thing about these tasks, though, is they are curriculum independent. So even though the schools we're looking at, they were following this iQuest curriculum, this is really designed that they don't go with a particular curriculum. They are supposed to just be three-dimensional and follow the NGSS guidelines. So a little bit about the NGSS. The NGSS is this integration of multi-dimensional ways of having students engage in science. So traditionally, students would focus more on like the disciplinary core ideas, like the disciplinary content. But the NGSS really calls for students to engage in not only the disciplinary content, but also science and engineering practices, and these cross-cutting concepts, these different concepts that sort of span across disciplines of science, right? So like cause and effect, for example. And so just a little bit about how the NGSS stuff is set up. So what students have is this larger performance expectation here. And the idea is that students have to engage in these three dimensions in order to reach this performance expectation. And so the NGSS has outlined relevant science and engineering practices, the disciplinary content, as well as these cross-cutting concepts, but all going toward this larger performance expectation, okay? And so in that, engaging students in this three-dimensional way, it really should help be more inclusive of students from more diverse backgrounds, all right? So we know that the dynamics of the student population in this country are changing, and so with that, so does our way of teaching and also our way of assessing. And so that's what we're going to be looking at today, is these assessments and how they have been designed around like the NGSS with this goal to provide greater access to students from diverse populations, okay? I want to spend a little second here, though, talking about our design of our assessment items in this project. So I'm going to move here so I can see a little better. So what this is our whole design process. I'm going to point out just a few things, though, because in our design process, we paid special attention. We also attended to aspects of equity and inclusion, not just in the final part where we're looking at the task, but in the entire design process, we included aspects of equity and inclusion. So first, we identified the target performance expectation and did an unpacking of that disciplinary core idea, the practices, and the cross-cutting concepts. But in that unpacking, we identified opportunities for equity and inclusion. So even in that unpacking, we started to think about students from diverse groups, right? And what information do we need to be unpacking? What information do we need to be including, right, in our unpacking, which is going to inform the rest of this design process. So we created these dimension maps that showed like the three dimensions coming together, right? And then we articulated these smaller learning performances. So we have the larger performance expectation. And what we have done is broken that down into smaller, more manageable chunks that we're calling learning performances. And we have multiple learning performances that reach a performance expectation. So then we went through and started to like look at the design features of our different tasks. And in that process, we determined like some guidelines, some equity and inclusion guidelines that we did go back and check our tasks against these things. So in doing that, it asked questions like had us look at readability, had us look at the making sure our tasks had a rich context, making sure that our texts were tasks were written clearly, and it was we had many different things we looked at, even things like the names that we used inside of the task, trying to use different names, right, inside of the task. So then after we designed the task, we went through and did this check and modified tasks accordingly, right? Now all of these tasks that we have designed can be found online. So these tasks are not just for people in the Chicagoland area. Anyone can access these tasks. And that's something that we have to think about in the design, is that many people may be able to access our tasks. And so what you'll find online, this is our portal, and what you'll find online, it looks something like this here. We have the larger performance expectation, and then under there, you'll see the learning performances. And under each learning performance, you find more than one task. We don't just have only one task, because teachers may want to choose a different task based on, the dynamics of their class, or, where they are in instruction. So this gives teachers an opportunity to pick from different tasks. And we just provide like a little name here that gives a idea of what the task might be about. And then within there, we also give a quick overview of the task. So this makes it a little bit easier for the teacher to just look and sort of see what tasks might fit their classroom a little bit better. And so what we're going to do now, though, is I want us to take a minute to look at one of these tasks. Today we're going to be talking about how students engaged in the task. So I want us to get with a group. You can get with a few people or get with a partner. Do not do this by yourself. The idea is to work with someone. And I want you to spend a few minutes looking at one of these tasks. So I'm just going to pass around papers. I know that I have not given you sufficient time to respond completely to the task, and that's okay. That's okay. So what I wanted to do, though, is to talk about how were you trying to approach the task. So I told you all earlier that our tasks are designed to really help teachers in instruction. So the tasks are not made to be like a summative assessment. They're an instructional tool. So I want to talk to you, the class, about how you engaged in the task. So can I first of all just sort of get a little summary from some of the groups of what you were trying to do to approach the task? I'm a teacher in real life, y'all. So like, I'm like, eye contact.
We were debating what the ideal sunflower was and whether height or weight was more important. And we were trying to see that, and we were frustrated by the gap in data between 4 and 16.
All right. Oh, you said you all were too.
Yeah.
Did anyone else have that same feeling? All right. A little bit differently. What were you all doing?
Well, I guess from the stem of the problem, I was trying to decide if you should plant more than 4 per 10 meters, or should he not? And so I started to look at the data in terms of what's the cumulative weight and height, and I found that once we moved from 4 to 16, that he could get more height per plant, but there was an inverse relationship between the weight per plant. So it depended on what he wanted. If he wanted more plants with more height, he can go a little bit higher than 4. If he wanted just more weight per plant, he would probably stay at 4 or somewhere around there. So that means we were all thinking something different.
And actually, I heard this group having a similar conversation. Alexa, would you like to share your conversation about the size of the sunflower?
So we struggled with the fact that, on the one hand, like, yes, we saw the drop, that it seemed like it was, when the prompt pointed at 4, it seemed like they were highlighting the drop that happens between height in terms of 234 to 207 and weight for 279 to 285. But considering that there were also 4 times as many plants, we felt like it was really rough to figure out, like, does it matter? Like, if they're selling the seeds, then you're probably actually getting more seeds with the 16 thing. But if you're selling them to sell, like, is there some kind of minimum height that you need for them to be valid? So, like, yeah, we were struggling with how to deal with those relationships.
Okay. What was some of the words you all were using? Like, digging back into, like, some of your background knowledge, what were some of the words that you all were using when you were trying to describe what the task was asking, or trying to describe the sunflowers? I heard an interesting conversation in the group in the back.
You did?
I did. I did. I heard a conversation about trade-offs.
Oh.
Yes.
Greg had the word inflection point.
Yeah, great.
So it was the question of what happens after 4 sunflowers, right? And so 4 becomes the inflection point here, but if I had some information about even 5 sunflowers, it would give me more with which to make a decision. I would say I don't know anything about sunflowers. And so, you know, if my purpose, for instance, was to sell sunflowers, and maybe I do want to plant 1,000, maybe I don't care about the height or the weight, but just the volume of, or the quantity of sunflower heads that I could, you know, sell in my shop if that was my purpose. So I think there are lots of questions to ask. Yes. I'm really curious as to why, as the creators of the task, you all chose to have that jump in data from 4 to 16.
Okay. We're going to stick a pin in that.
Right.
And yes?
My only related comment to that is I have seen this task before, and I will say that after having seen this task and thought about it, I am now hyper aware of all of the sunflowers in my neighbors' yards. Like, walking around Chicago, I would have told you before seeing this, like, I never see a sunflower. And now I'm like, these sunflowers are this tall, those ones are that tall. Like, that, how tall is that many? Yeah. They're in your life.
So one of the things that I know also is that based on the subspecies of sunflower you pick, the height and the weight of those things vary. So you have titans that grow up to like 8 to 9 feet and have flowers that are bigger than my face. And you have stuff that's about yay big and have teeny tiny flowers. So my first question is like, what type of sunflowers are these? Because again, that sort of ties back into the trade-offs. Because if you're hoping to sell sunflower seeds, you might want one of those titans with a zillion seeds in there. Like my neighbor's neighbor, like 3 houses away, has one of those titans, and I have seeds in my yard.
Awesome.
As opposed to if you want to sell the flowers, you might want to go for like the teeny tiny ones that look very pretty in a bouquet.
So another thing that I think came up in our discussions was, ultimately this is a economic question too. Like, the farmer wants to make money, and so what's underspecified in the question are the other costs that are associated with the density of how you plant the sunflowers, because ostensibly, the more densely packed they are, you might need more pesticides, which as a result causes you to spend more per square meter than if you had used a less dense arrangement of sunflowers, and so that's going to affect your profitability. So there's a lot of things that are unsaid that also would change your decision-making process.
This will be our last one. I love this rich conversation, but this will be our last one. This is awesome, though.
So what you asked about before, like what from our own lives or what sort of like language, I think I said the word story or narrative at a certain point, and a lot of what we're talking about right now seems to be like the motivation of the story behind this farmer. And so what you said then started to make me think, okay, yeah, but like, what's the machinery like? Like, does it cost more to use the machines or to have people pick them if you have more versus less? And so, yeah, knowing the actual story to me was important.
So I think this was a really, really rich conversation that we had here that hit on a lot of points. So I want us to take a quick minute to think about who we are and our position, right? So we have been to school. We're not in middle school anymore, right? We've had a lot of different background experiences, but even within this room, I heard some people say I have no experience with sunflowers. I heard, what if you don't know about a sunflower? We heard stories about big sunflowers. We heard stories about, our experiences with interacting with sunflowers. Because I heard a great story over here about an interaction with a sunflower. And so we came from different background knowledges in different spaces in here, right? And then even within our groups, we heard people interacting in different ways. It was on purpose that we didn't want you to do it by yourselves. We heard people telling stories right there within the group. We heard, we saw people pull out their computer and open up Excel and say, I'm about to figure this thing out. We heard a lot of different conversations. We saw people using different tools. And so that's what this conversation is about then. What were some of those things that the teachers were doing in the enacting of their tasks? Now here though, I'm going to pay special attention to two particular areas. One is funds of knowledge. Leveraging students' knowledge from outside of the school context. And it was great. I heard us doing it in here. Leveraging what students know from outside of the school context, but not just like, yeah, that's cool, you see these sunflowers in your neighbor's yard. But how then does this help us understand the sunflower? How then could this help those students that never heard about the sunflower? And then what kind of conversations might happen around these sunflowers that really help to bring students into the story, help students engage with the task, okay? And so one thing that we know that learning is this cultural process, but we also know that in many science classrooms, that is not being leveraged to help bring students into the science. And so what we were looking at and what I was looking at in this study is how students then use the NGSA task if they considered culture, if they engaged in cultural practices, and if they considered, students' funds of knowledge and use that to help students make connections to the task. And so when I'm talking about how did they leverage culture, I'm talking about some of these cultural practices that we even saw happening within this space. Really legitimizing the real life experiences of the student, not brushing those off, really helping students to engage in that way. And also to engage in collaborative learning. We were not in competition with one another in this room about which group was about to figure it out first. We were engaging in the conversations together. We were working collaboratively. We were establishing community in the room, and still maintaining that academic rigor. No one came by to give you the answer because they saw you struggling through trying to figure it out. And so that's what we're looking at in here. And so the research questions for this project were: in what ways are teachers able to use the NGSA test to leverage students' funds of knowledge? And also, in what ways were teachers able to use the NGSA test that allowed students to engage in cultural practices? So the way that we looked at this is we had, I designed an observation protocol using like 3 major sources. So one consideration was Gloria Ladson-Billings' work around culturally relevant pedagogy, where students' culture is really leveraged to help bring them into this new culture, this new science culture, this science classroom culture, while maintaining academic rigor. Now, one thing, and we did another presentation about this at AERA last year, was looking at some of those tensions, though, with like helping students to engage in socio-political engagement around the task. That was one of the tensions we noticed. So that is an aspect of the Gloria Ladson-Billings work that we do recognize there's a tension here. Also drawing from 2 other pieces of work that looked at like reform-based teaching and teaching for inclusion, particularly for English language learners. And so we took these 3 ideas and blended together to make an observation protocol that we used inside of the classrooms when we did the observations. So I do want to talk just a little bit about what were some of those points specifically we were looking at on the observation protocol. So first, like a few examples, when we were looking at how the task was introduced, or how like we were able to engage students in the classroom culture and the science culture, bringing in their own culture, looking at like teachers helping students engage in their prior knowledge, teachers helping students make connections by valuing their experiences outside of school, students merging what they know about science with their background knowledge to talk about the tasks, or just a few. We also looked at the actual task engagement, where students were encouraged to make connection with the disciplinary content. So I want to pause here though and go back to our conversation we had earlier. I heard, based on the different groups, I heard some of our groups using like vocabulary specific to like disciplines that I know you all operate in. And so how were students able to like take the words they know, the language that they know, and engage with the task? Because our tasks are found on the computer and in our classrooms, teachers were actually enacting them using the computer. Did teachers engage students in some way about the use of the technology that they needed? Did students understand what the task was and get the opportunity to really unpack that task? Was the lesson rigorous for each student? So these were some of those things we looked at there. And then, in order for this to happen, how was the culture of the classroom set up by the teachers? So were the students encouraged to communicate their ideas? Were they encouraged to talk? Did the teachers like check for some kind of prior knowledge to sort of get the students started? Was there some kind of discussion or engagement to get students interested? And then how was that classroom sort of set up in a way that students' voices were respected within the space by everybody, the teacher and the other students? So these were some of the things we were looking at in the observation protocol. Yes.
Can I ask just a clarifying question? So
yes.
You were observing teachers doing these assessment activities.
Yes.
And just using that sort of as a checklist to say what's happening here, are they doing these different things?
So, and what you'll see here in just a moment with the data is actually looking specifically at talk around the different things and behaviors that were happening in the classroom. So, all right. So I want us to talk a little bit about like how we approached looking at the task. So, first, the schools that we were partnered with were in the Chicagoland area, suburban schools in the Chicagoland area with pretty diverse student populations within the school. The schools were using the iQuest curriculum. We were in one district. They were using the iQuest curriculum, which is an NGSS aligned curriculum. And that's just to give some perspective about where the students are, but remembering that the tasks we designed are curriculum independent, not specific for iQuest. there were 3 of us who went into classes. And this was not our first time going into the classes. The teachers, I think this was the 3rd time, teachers had enacted NGSA tasks. So teachers were familiar with the task. They had used the task before in their instruction. And Farmer Nelson was one of the tasks we used. We also looked at another one, Peter's bird interactions. We looked at this in 3 classrooms. So it was 3 researchers. We looked at this happening in 3 classrooms. But today I'm just going to talk about the Farmer Nelson that you all engaged with. But we did look at more than one task. And then we used field notes to complete this observation protocol. And so everyone has our Farmer Nelson task. So you sort of have an idea of some of the things that, you know, some of the things that the students had to ask themselves and to do. And we're just going to take a little deep dive into Farmer Nelson. So broadly, some of the things we saw that all of the teachers that we observed 3 teachers, all of the teachers really took some time to make sure that the students understood the data table. We even heard talk about why did they use centimeters and grams and not like inches and pounds. We heard that kind of talk. And we saw the teachers sort of help the students figure out like what they're pulling out of the data table. We saw at least 2 of the teachers really attend to the vocabulary, some of the science-specific vocabulary, and point out that we're making sure that we're using proper vocabulary. And then some of the other things that we saw, because you're going to see us talk about 3 teachers, we saw at least 2 of the teachers like using some examples that the students could relate to. And you know, we saw a few different ways that teachers were engaging. So what I want to do though is look specifically at some of the things the teachers did, particularly around funds of knowledge and cultural practices in the room. So our 3 teachers are Lisa, David, and Troy. Okay? And so Lisa, she opens up with a review from her iQuest curriculum of a task that the students had been working on. And then she transitions to the task by first talking to students about their background knowledge, talking to students about sunflowers. Do you know what a sunflower is? Helping the students engage in that. She reminds the students about the scientific language. They talk about making sure they're using centimeters and grams. And she reminds the students during the different activities, she reminds them about the culture that her classroom has to respect people's, you know, respect the way that the conversations might emerge within the room. And then a few things also that she did, she allowed students to embody the sunflowers. And she also did another activity where she had the students come to the board and draw a box and draw the sunflowers. And so this answers some of this question that people were asking around the room here. What if I don't know what a sunflower is? I don't understand this. So she took students outside of the task in that way. So David, we'll see that David has a more traditional view of science and science learning. So he did discuss the data table. He didn't give students the answer, but he did like provide some hints for students. And he encourages students to give a robust quality response. And he tells students it's not about the length of the response. Make sure that, you know, you have a nice robust response. He didn't use the word robust, but he, you know, spoke to the middle school class about making sure that they gave a really rich response, right? And he also points back to examples about students being in testing situations. And then Troy also opens with a review from a previous lesson before he transitions to the task. He does a few activities also to engage the students about like experiences they might have outside of the classroom to try to help students make some connections with the task. So I want us to look a little bit at what each teacher did specifically. So Lisa, in really trying to access like the students' knowledge outside of the school setting, she first just like points to the sunflowers and asks students to tell her what they know about the sunflowers. And in that talk, one student points out that they eat sunflowers. And Lisa asked the whole class, so this set of students says, like the sunflowers we eat? And then she asked the whole class, who eats sunflower seeds? To really, not to push off what the students said, but now let's use this example that the students gave to help us engage in understanding what these flowers are in the first place. We saw Troy make some connections to students, like in terms of the number of people who live in the student's house. And he says, if you throw 3 people in your house, it's going to get ugly. We'll compete for resources. He targets one student and says, you're an only child. And student says yes, and he says, so life is good. But when there are more, they will compete. And then we see a group of students start talking about how many siblings they have, and if their brother comes, and they start to talk about like this competition that might happen if there are more people in the house. Now David, he made some connections to like other testing situations, but this is not really looking at students' outside experiences and outside knowledge to come in. But as I said earlier, it's not that David didn't do anything. It's just when we're looking for David's attending to funds of knowledge, he didn't make any other connections outside of the class. Now, when we look at culture, as I said, Lisa, one of the things she did was have students come up to the board and draw, they drew a box, and then they had to draw 4 sunflowers in the box. So this goes around this conversation, which I heard everybody like struggling between this like 4 and 16 space. And she had students come up and draw 4 sunflowers on the box. And then Lisa also says, like, she helps people like think like they are Farmer Nelson. And so they come, she says, your job is to see if you agree that you should plant 4 based on the data. And there was also some other talk in here about like, you are Farmer Nelson, you got to sell some sunflowers, right? You got to harvest some sunflowers. And so she has students come up and stand in a box on the floor, 4 students. And then she's like, what if I put some more students in that box? What's going to happen? Because this is our space that we have. And so really allowing students to act this out. So even if a student did not know what a sunflower is, still helping students to sort of get an idea of what this might look like. Now Troy, and this actually happened in all of the classes. All of the classes had students working in groups to some extent to work on these tasks. But then students were answering independently on the computer. And so we saw Troy engaging the students also in collaborative learning. And then here I wanted to point out some of this vocabulary around the use of centimeter versus inch. But look here, where a student is trying to like give their idea about how much a centimeter is, and Troy gives the answer. He says, the only reason I know this is because I looked it up. And so it's okay that everybody didn't know exactly, because I had just looked it up. So he's helping the students try to like make sense of this like science specific vocabulary and get into using the vocabulary a little bit, and also having the students work in groups. And then as did David. David had the students working in groups to answer the task. So what we did see, we saw like within our task, what we really tried to do was make sure that we provided images that we provided multiple ways for students to access information, and that we provided some kind of rich context within that within the task for students to be able to have some conversations and think around, because these are not made to be like they're made to be embedded within the instruction. And we saw that for the most part, teachers were able to build on that context to like bring students into the task. We did see a little bit that David had a more traditional view of science, and he talked more about students being able to like get the right answer, and gave some conversation around what is the right answer, and what does that look like to get the right answer, and you've taken tests before, and having that conversation. And we did see, though, the other two teachers tried to really pull apart, tried to like unpack some student misconceptions, and demonstrate for students how they might be able to respond to the task. And so, particularly around funds of knowledge, we saw attention to students' home life, attention to student experiences with sunflower, with planting things. Another example that I didn't show was in Troy's class. He asked students, do you have any experience planting things? What's on the back of that pack? And they talked about like what's on the back of the seed pack when you're planting seeds. And there was a conversation about that to try to tap into even more student experiences. There was conversation to try to address some of the misconceptions around like some of the scientific language that was used. And we saw teachers, at least two of those teachers, explicitly reach for students like out of school knowledge and use and leverage that to help students to engage more with the task. In terms of culture, we saw like with Lisa's class, the role play, the embodiment. We saw at least two of those teachers really legitimize the students' real life experiences. We saw the community that was set up in the class, the culture that was set up within the class, that it was not a competitive nature. Students were learning together. They were working with groups, and they were working as a class to try to figure out how do we attack this task, right? And through this, the teacher did not just give the answers. The teacher made it rigorous, gave students opportunities to struggle through the task and to talk through the task to try to make sense of the information that they had in order to answer the task. So I wanted to sort of leave us with some questions that we might be able to think about in here and hopefully discuss a little bit in here, is how could we further support teachers, knowing what we've said about these observations. How could we further support teachers to be able to use the task to leverage students' funds of knowledge and engagement in cultural practices? What could we do to be intentional about helping teachers do this? And then also, what supports might we be able to offer that support the use of our tasks in consideration for like societal issues and social issues? So I did want to see what some of our thoughts might be here before we end. Any thoughts?
So with regard to the first question, I wonder if there is some additional or supplemental material that teachers can have to guide how they launch into a task like this, how they facilitate students' conversations amid the task. So for instance, with regard to the launch, just looking at the first line here, Foreman Nelson is planting sunflowers on his farm. And this is not flippant at all, but why should the kids care about Farmer Nelson and what he wants to do? So, how do you give students an entry portal into this problem that interests them, that draws on their background knowledge, that at least primes it, right, to get them thinking about how they might connect what they know to what the problem is asking them. But maybe some sort of supplemental material for teachers to help guide students into and then through their process.
Yes, ma'am?
I would think that for teachers like David, like explicitly using the language that he uses, like rigor and like the right answer and developing scaffolding for him to understand, or teachers like him to understand how to go from, yeah, we eat sunflower seeds to what is the right answer. Helpful.
I mean, I was thinking about the second question, which is in using the tasks to help them engage with societal issues, right? And I feel like a lot of the stuff that we were discussing here, like economics and ecologies and like resources that are necessary, could probably tie into that, but like given that, I feel like the context needs to be richer, but I'm not sure whether you provide the context to the students or offer context opportunities, like these are the different kind of contexts to the teachers.
Well, I'm thinking about like societal issues, instead of thinking like something like really big, try and like bring it back to their own school community, and maybe sort of mention maybe opportunities where you could like look about making smaller changes that the students are able to see closer to home. So like if we're talking about like kids who live in a city, right? Like is there an urban like garden on a corner? And if there's not, why don't we start one? Or do we have a school garden? And if not, then why don't we start one? So the school that I did did exactly that. We went through this whole process of creating a school garden behind the school. And so like just smaller things that they can change and feel like really good about going through that process and seeing those results will then ultimately, hopefully, like scaffold them to pick larger and larger societal issues.
So the thing I was thinking about is the framing of the tasks as what their purpose is, in the sense of, are they there to engage in, like I see this one as being very supportive of the science and engineering practice of argument. And especially when you're trying to support that, is the whole point that there isn't a right answer. Because like we had so many different things that we needed to consider, and so many different people were talking about trade-offs. And that's a huge piece of the practice of arguing, which is not a traditional thing in science classrooms where, well, yeah, but what's the right answer? And being like, well, we're going to argue about this. And both sides can be right because both sides have different priorities. So like one needs more stems or whatever, one needs more seeds. And so that makes a difference. And I really see that. And so maybe something that helps teachers understand when a right answer is important and when a right answer is not important, and how to address that with students who have been told all their lives there's a right answer.
Get the right answer.
Get the right answer.
I mean, now that I've just heard what Laura was saying, I was just thinking you could just complicate the question more. Give them, the cost of each of the resources, cost of seeds for different
for the sixth graders. But you could give more like background information.
Well, that's what I was thinking. That actually, to me, is the difference between giving them all that information up front, or either making it available to the teacher if the students ask for it, or making because this is online anyway, making like a space for them to like ask for more information and find it. Because I think offering all of the information they could possibly want is a very bad way to support the task. But I think giving space for them to push and be like, what might you wonder, is really great. And showing a table that's like if the table was these data points, and then they could be like, I want to know what's between 4 and 16. And the teacher had a way to be like, oh, poof, now we have like 4 more data points in between there. Is a great way to have conversation.
And I think I definitely agree with the point about like purpose being missing. Because if, the reason I was thinking of this was also if you just generally had, which one would give the farmer Nelson more profit? Sort of a thing. Like.
But then that does go into the question we heard, then what are you selling? Are you selling pretty sunflowers? Does more profit mean, that you're selling the small pretty sunflowers, or do you want the big heads with the most seeds? So that.
Well, then you get into the issue of, is this a one-time task, or are we building a curricular
Or is
activity?
this a project?
Because that could be an awesome project where like they're comparing different possible things to sell and how your priorities are like.
Mhm.
But is that very different from what this assessment portal is for?
Right.
How do you decide that?
Right. Josh?
Well, I'm just curious how the team that is creating the task is thinking about equity. Because like equity is how we started. And we're talking now about different aspects of the task. You showed us 3 different teachers and the ways that they kind of built access to the problem, or giving their students access to thinking about the math and the botany, I guess, behind the problem. But how were you guys thinking about equity when you were looking at these teachers, and how is the design team that's making these tasks thinking about equity? What's their meaning of equity?
So when we were designing the task, we actually drew from a number of different sources to provide like multiple lenses to equity. So one of the things we looked at was language. And we looked at the language we were using, and then we went back to every task and we did like the readability check, which it was funny because like every task was above the readability level when we first did the task. And so now we had to go back and rewrite a few times to get the readability level so these tasks are designed for students grades 6 to 8. So we made sure the readability stayed within 6 to 8. Some other things we looked at, so we have multiple different tasks. Some other things we looked at was some of the scaffolding within the task. So like, do you ask students, if you were doing an argumentation task, do you tell the students to just engage in argumentation? Or we also have some tasks that say, make a claim, provide evidence, like really scaffold what we're looking for. We looked at also multimodality and how we represented the data in the task, whether we used data tables, graphs, those things. We tried to attend to some of the, we tried to make sure the context was rich enough that students could engage, but giving teachers room to build. What were some of the other things, Brian? Do you remember? Are you with us, Brian?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. I think, those language supports, the relevance of the phenomenon were the ones that
Were the big ones.
The big ones in my head in terms of the review criteria.
And we even did things like we looked at, we did cognitive labs with students too, and looked at how students were engaging in the task, and some of our features had to be changed for some of the tasks. So, for example, we had one task with the ballerina task. We had a task where it was this simulation, and students clicked this button and it was cool, and they learned about the ballerina eating and getting energy. But the way it was set up on the page, many students were missing one of the click points because of just the way it was set up on the page. And so we even looked at just the presentation of the task. And many tasks had to be rewritten from the first version of the task. Yes.
So you brought up a ballerina task and ballerina eating. I think that kind of speaks to the second question of societal issues, like eating disorders are a thing, and that type of task can be it is related to that, and it's like, okay, like what issues are there? And it's like, okay, again, where are your priorities? Because there are different things, so.
And we did try to make the context rich enough in the task, and I know that's a conversation that came up a lot in the task design, was like providing rich context. You're just asking this question. Why do students care? You have to say something more about why students would care. I know I had written one that I was so pleased with, and it really got cut up because I was all over the place with this great issue. It was about locusts, and there wasn't really a reason at first why students cared that these locusts were coming and attacking these cotton crops, you know. And so we had a lot of group discussion about that, and even after observing the tasks being enacted and observing students engaging in the task, even after we had done that initial review, we even went back and had to do even more revisions to the task.
So bear with me because I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this, but when you bring up the ballerina thing and talking about societal issues, so I could see like take it in two ways. On one hand, like ballet in general is something that's like financially inaccessible to the vast majority of humans. And so when I hear that, when I hear a ballerina task, half of my mind goes towards what would the cost be to just say dancer? Because dance is accessible to everybody. But then
Didn't we change it to
I
dancer?
think it is dancer now.
We changed it to dancer.
oh, cool.
Yeah. We did, right? We changed it to.
I think the title is, but I can't remember if the image has changed.
Yeah, I think
I think it's a dancer's energy, but there was a
It-
second part.
I was gonna say, I don't think it used the word ballerina.
I think when we started with the design of that task, we started with ballerina, and then we went to someone was dancing and they needed the food for the energy to dance fast and dance. So I would have to look that one up. I'll look it up before we leave to see how we made the modifications to that task.
The second part of that, so that, I'll let you take it. But the second part that I was curious about is that if you do elect to use ballerina, do you see it as like scaffolding the kids into familiarity with cultural aspects of dominant culture that they are often excluded from? And do you view that as something valuable? Because when we were discussing the articles in Journal Club, it came up of like the kids don't have experience with sunflowers, but it's probably good for them to have experience with other cultures. You know, like what is your thought process on that, on like scaffolding kids into dominant culture versus scaffolding the problem into the child's language?
So part of this is really being able to do both. Is being able to leverage, do the task, provide opportunities where we can leverage what the students might know and help bring them into this science cultural space. Now, like this is a great conversation that's coming up about societal issues, and that was one of the tensions that we talked about in our AERA proposal, was looking at some of, if we're looking at how this task could be used in terms of more like socio-political awareness, our task, there's a tension there between the ways the tasks are designed and teachers doing that. Teachers can build on it, but it's not something that is just like embedded within the task. That is a tension that we recognize. But what I was really looking at here is how can we still, how did we watch teachers? So I wasn't looking at how can we, I was looking more at like how the teachers in their enactments of the task, how were those teachers able to pull what students knew, but still bring them into this space where they're learning something new about science and engaging in science in a different way.
So, Krystal, I was thinking the same thing. So the key would be the choice of how the teacher pulls it in, which could then be supported by what type of pedagogy that they would utilize. So for example, for that first question, if I'm in a room full of African American kids and we're talking about sunflowers, my choice selection would be, okay, I need to see what they are aware about. Now I know there's the science standards and the overall arching performance goal, and then the task, because the task to me seems like that is a smorgasbord of ways to enact it. So how my choice as a teacher becomes very important, and how my engagement as an instructor becomes important too. So my first thing is to try to decide how I'm going to set up about that engagement and what they know. To then decide which choices make sense. So if I have students that we have ask a key question, what do you know about growing plants? What do you know about growing sunflowers? What has been your experience about that? And take that language, or even ask them, okay, let's Google it and see what you guys come up with, and let's have a discussion. That then suggests how I then would approach some of these tasks. That's how I would do it, and that way I get engagement, I get relativity to what's part of their background. I might even use their language, and I'll jump back to which task kind of moves into it, which is the onus is all about me being in the moment and being able to make those pedagogy type choices within the guidelines of the tasks that have been well designed and the overarching learning objective.
Ask perhaps a different kind of question about the societal issue. And I think my question is, can there be some more intentionality around the kinds of societal issues that you want to point students toward? And I guess just to add some quick context to that, in the math education community, there's been some tension around how do you connect equity discourses to standard setting discourses. And one of the offshoots of that conversation has been about how do we think about neoliberalism in relation to math tasks. I was struck by, even in our conversations about this task, that a lot of our conversation went toward economic profitability as sort of one way to think about the purpose of doing this, instead of, say, environmentalism or other kinds of societal concerns. And so I'm wondering, what can makers of tasks like these do to sort of insert some greater intentionality to steer students perhaps to more particular socio-political issues?
That might be relevant to the student in New York, the student in Mississippi, and the student in Colorado. And that's one of the things one of the tensions we did recognize in trying to do this and making these tasks that are being used all over the United States. And I think, Brian, we've seen them used even internationally, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And some of these tasks are even being used internationally. So then how do you think about that?
So I have some questions about how teachers are using the test themselves and and what information you're collecting. So you said, it seems already that you know where people are downloading the information from. But so for the people that you looked at and observed their classrooms, they knew you were coming. Had you seen them, I'm just trying to think of did the teachers maybe just present the tasks in particular ways because there was an audience there? Or do we know if teachers are just thank God this is a science task and it looks really good. Okay, everyone, here are the worksheets. I didn't have to plan this. How do you know how people are using these things right now?
So in the classrooms that we observed, this was not our first time working with them. We had observed them on a few occasions. This was, I think, our third time watching them enact these tasks, enact different tasks in their classrooms. And we had seen them do it in different ways depending on the point of instruction they were using the task. So we had seen other ones of our tasks used to introduce lessons. We've seen them used at the end of units. And we saw this one, these two, the Farmer Nelsons and the Peters Birds that we didn't talk about here, we saw those sort of embedded within. So right before the teachers enacted this task, students had already been doing this iQuest unit. And this task was enacted on these days after the teacher started with some background about the unit they had been working on. So we saw the task happening. We saw these teachers use the task in different ways at different times. And then ideally, if we provide the task in order to engage students, it really does take some kind of planning. And so students have to even be familiar with how to get in the portal. So when we first started doing this, we saw even some learning curves with students getting in the portal. This was done though just at a different place where teachers were using the task a little bit more in the middle of their instruction. Was this in the middle? This was a little like they had already done something. So students were not coming into these tasks with like no knowledge of the information yet. Students had already been exposed to some information that should help them engage in the task.
So you say that there are teachers basically all over the world using these tasks, and you ask about supports for teachers. Obviously, the supports for the teachers you know are going to be slightly different from the teachers you don't know, because the teachers you know can ask you questions. But what kind of supports are available to the teachers on the teacher side of things that help them do this? Because obviously these tasks are not teacher independent. They are very teacher dependent, because that context and that building of it, and that's all very involved. So what sort of supports are there for the teacher to understand that?
So something that we have, and when teachers go to the portal, they are prompted to like create an account, and then they can create a classroom and they can add their students to their classroom. And within there, for each one of our tasks, we have a rubric. And it's not a rubric that's like, I keep pushing that. It's not a rubric that's like you get 1 point for this, 2 points for this. It's a rubric that says these are the things that students should be able to do if they are proficient in this, to answer this task proficiently. We have a second section that says if students are still developing their proficiency, this is the things that students will be able to do at least. And then if students are at the very beginning level of understanding, these are the things that students will be able to do. And so when a teacher looks at this rubric, they can see what does it mean for a student to be proficient in being able to answer this task. And this includes not only just getting the right answer, because none of our tasks are just like a number or yes or no. You know, it's not like they just say 4. Because we also say for students, for example, with the Farmer Nelson task, we tell students to include some examples from the data table. And so this makes students have to analyze and interpret data. They have to go over here to the data table and give some information. And then it says state why the number of sunflowers planted in that area affects their growth. So not just looking at the table, but then being able to also explain why. So a student who could do all 3 of those things would be proficient. And so that's what we do provide teachers now, so that they can just look at those rubrics and see, based on what's in this rubric, where does my student stand in terms of their development of understanding?
So maybe one more question, sorry.
Oh, that's fine, go for it.
No, yeah, one more, we got time for one more question, and then we can move it outside?
Oh, okay, I was just gonna say,
We don't
in
need to
addition,
take it
you,
outside, I meant we can. Right here. We can move it here, sorry, Ryan.
I was just gonna say, you also might wanna mention that in addition to the rubrics, there's also those teacher resources that are like next instructional steps.
Yeah, I don't think we call them scaffolding tables, but we have also some materials we provide teachers about like how to move instruction using the task.
Using the feedback.
Using the feedback for the students. Oh, and there's student feedback. And so students get feedback that says you are developing to become proficient, you have to do this. And so it also gives students where they are. So those are some of the things we give teachers. So like if a student is developing, the teacher should know they should help the student.
So is there anything that supports them in the pre-matter space? The stuff that, like the data that you were looking at looked very much at how the teacher was setting up the task. Are there any supports for how to set up these tasks?
No.
I was going to ask if there's any like
try to connect this to your students' past, like basically pulling from this and being like, here are some possible questions you can ask your students. What experience do they have with sunflowers? What experience do they have with plants or other like things that have tight resources? Like, and not that
No,
you
we
would want
don't
to
have
script
that.
it, but a couple ideas would be a way to address the first question
And I
up
feel
there.
like the example context thing that I was saying could also help, like,
Mm-hmm.
it sets up what you're trying to do with the task.
I know we said one more, can we do one
What, 4 more?
more? We really meant four.
I'm curious about the societal issues part of
Mhm.
this, and I was wondering if there's like some sort of crowdsourcing that can happen with like getting teachers to say, here in this country, we care about this social issue, and it got brought up when I looked at this task. Is there like some way to get teachers' conception of what social issues that come up from these tasks?
And see, I think that's where I think the context of the task is written in a way that if a teacher does have an issue they want to attend to, they can use that to sort of set up their task and set up why a student would care about this. Like here, our teachers were, like Troy, for example, Troy was talking about competition. And so he brought up like some issues about like living situations and that kind of stuff. So a teacher could take an issue that is relevant in their particular area to their particular class, because every class is going to be a bit different. And then every year it's going to be different, because every year you're going to get a whole new set of students in there. And as the world is changing, issues are changing. And so we're hoping, though, that the tasks are still written in a rich enough way that teachers can still build off of that. Like they can still, no matter who comes into their classroom, be able to dig back in some way. But I do like these ideas of like ways that we might also be able to think about richer context.
Maybe a really cool discussion boards for the VLC that Meg was coming in, because the projects are connected with each other. And so even if it wasn't the project writing, these are the answers, having space for teachers to have a discussion board to talk about with each other what's worked for them would be cool.
So, well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.